documentary Arc of Justice, the Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of a Beloved Community. This is an example of one of those equity models that works. After the film, we'll have a discussion featuring the producer of the documentary, who's also the founder of New Communities, as well as other experts on the topic of racial equity and community development. One of those experts is the Denver Foundation's very own LaDon Sullivan, who I'd now like to turn the mic over to. LaDon? LaDon, you've got to take yourself off mute.
Okay, trust me, my speech was amazing at the beginning. I'm so sorry you all weren't able to hear it. So thank you so much, Javier, for that introduction. And I'm so excited to be here with friends and colleagues, new friends, old friends as well, to really have a moment to elevate a true story of racial equity that we're so pleased to be a partner with the Urban Land Conservancy in supporting the showing of this documentary. Just a little bit about the Denver Foundation's direct work regarding racial equity in its most recent state. The Denver Foundation, in light of the most recent two pandemics, COVID-19 and the escalated racial violence happening in our country, saw a unique opportunity to answer the call to our longstanding community partners, those who are leading Black-led and Black-serving organizations, addressing their exacerbation from these two pandemics and recognizing that there was a unique opportunity to be supportive of their work, those who are on the front lines doing the great work of supporting their organizations and the communities in which they live. And so we, on June 19th, which happens to be Juneteenth, established the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund. It is a fund with a goal of raising $1.5 million in its first year to provide supports to Black-led and serving organizations at $1 million in its first year. And we are well on our way to that goal. Very excited to have unique opportunities to support Black leaders, Black organizations as they continue the fight for racial equity, particularly in the Black community. And one of our longstanding partners, particularly through the Denver Foundation's over 20 years of working explicitly in communities of color, has been the Urban Land Conservancy. And so I'm very excited to share this platform in this moment with Aaron Mirapol.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Hi, Aaron Mirapol, President of Urban Land Conservancy. We are honored to be here tonight to be a partner with the Denver Foundation in presenting Arc of Justice. We were founded over 17 years ago as a nonprofit to really go about acquiring, developing, and preserving real estate for long-term community benefits. Working with underserved communities at risk of displacement and using the Community Land Trust, we've made 43 investments and developments over the last 17 years, working closely with the Denver Foundation in a number of communities. The need, however, is obviously much more urgent than ever before. We believe at ULC the best way to maintain permanent affordability, be it in housing, be it in schools, nonprofit facilities, is using the Community Land Trust. And we also acknowledge that access to capital is one of the biggest barriers for many property owners, especially those organizations run and led by folks of color. When I got a chance to hear about BRIC back in June from LaDon and from Dan Lee, I called them up and said, how can we help? What can we do to support this critical initiative? And thanks to their work, I'm happy and excited to announce tonight that ULC is providing a $250,000 low interest loan in connection with the BRIC initiative. These loans will be prioritized for pre-development or capital expenditures with up to a maximum of $50,000 per organization. We hope in our small investment, we will be able to attract other investors locally to help move the progress for Black-led organizations who are looking to expand their footprint in Metro Denver area. Tied to the work of BRIC is understanding that it takes a community to make equitable development and ownership happen. In Arc of Justice, you will learn about the power of community and coming together to be the largest Black-owned property community in the United States 50 years ago. From my work on a moshav, a cooperative farm in Israel, to being a tenant organizer in Chicago, I learned about the power of community land trust and what it meant to own the land as community. Ms. Sherrod, I can only call you Ms. Sherrod. I'm sorry, I can't say Shirley. You have, it's not often, honestly, that you get an opportunity, you get an opportunity to be with one of your heroes. And I got to hear you speak in Athens, Georgia, back in 2009 at the National Community Land Trust Conference. Excuse me. What you had to say that day was incredibly powerful. I want to also acknowledge our friends in Athens, Georgia, who have been a big part of the work on community land trust. But your story, and then Helen, your ability to take that story to make a documentary is something that I view as so critical to the work we do. And as I said, I'm honored to be a part of this. ULC is honored to be a part of it, but it is the struggle, Ms. Sherrod, of the 50 plus years that you've gone through that is really inspiring to all of us. And I thank you for being a part of it. And I thank Mr. Pickett as well, who helped make Arc of Justice happen as well. I'll now turn it over to you, Ms. Clerk, or I guess now I turn it to the documentary. Is that right? Okay, thanks.
Well, I feel like we need to clap now, like we're in a theater. So now we're going to shift to reflecting on the film and to our panel discussion. My name is Erin Clark. I am a proud employee of Urban Land Conservancy here in Denver, where I serve as the Vice President of Master Site Development. And I'm so honored to be here today to moderate this panel with wonderful dignitaries who work with land trusts and with land use and equity every day across this country. So I'm first going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll dig into the meat here. So the first panelist who we're so honored to have with us today is Miss Shirley Sherrod herself, joining us from Albany, Georgia. I like to say Albany. Albany is for New York, but Albany is for Georgia. And she's a civil rights leader and co-founder of New Communities Land Trust. And we're so grateful to have you joining us today. Thank you. Next, you've already heard a bit from LaDawn Sullivan, who is here in Denver. She's the Director of Leadership and Equity at the Denver Foundation. And as she noted earlier, the Managing Director of the new Black Resilience in Colorado Fund, or BRIC. Following her, we have Tony Pickett. Please wave. He is currently the Executive Director of Grounded Solutions Network, which is a national network that supports shared equity homeownership and permanent affordable housing solutions. And he's joining us today from Alexandria, Virginia. And finally, we have with us Helen Cohen. She is an award-winning filmmaker and painter. She's based in San Francisco, and she is the producer and director of the wonderful film that we just saw, Arc of Justice. So thank you, Helen, for joining us as well. So with that, I'm going to jump into some questions. First, just this was actually I believe it's my third viewing of the film Arc of Justice. Others within the organization have seen it, I think, probably upwards of 10 times. But it's definitely one that is just so heartwarming every time and heartbreaking every time that we see it. We hear a lot in the film about the power of owning land, that land is power. But also we saw clearly forces at work that can often work against long-term land ownership by people of color. So barriers to acquiring the property in the first place, and then to holding on to it once you have it. It makes me think of that kind of alternative golden rule, that he who has the gold makes the rules. And this really is that where, so I wanted to just first, we'll dig into some of those themes a little more as we go on. But first, Ms. Sherrod, I know you said I could call you Shirley, but I
Yes.
kind of, I agree with Erin that I keep coming back to Ms. Sherrod. If you could just provide our audience here just an update on what is happening on the property that you own now, Resora, and how are things working out? And in particular, have there been any impacts from the COVID pandemic on your operations there?
Yes. Good evening, everyone, and it's great to be with you. I love sharing the work that we're doing. When we acquired this property in 2011, it was used as a place for hunting and a place for the owner to host the Boy Scouts and all of his friends to have a good time. One of the things we did was to clean it up. We didn't, in fact, we have not allowed any hunting on it other than a few wild hogs, because that's not the focus here. We want to use this property to not only lift up the work of new communities, but we have persistent poor counties in Southwest Georgia, and we work with all of them. So we, of course, farming is one of the things that's big in this area and one of the things we know. So you saw in the film there were pecan trees. Those trees were not producing when we got the property, but we brought them back into production. They're about 100 years old, maybe a little more than 100 years old, and still producing crops. But we added 115 acres of pecan trees that, believe it or not, there is a bumper crop on those trees this year. When Trump decided that there would be tariffs against China, a lot of the pecans out of the US were going to China. They somehow believed that meat, that pecan meat looks like brain food, so they love it. So I knew as small growers, we would have a real problem. Back in the 90s, I organized pecan growers to sell to Ben & Jerry's ice cream company. They wanted to do something about Black land loss and said they would be willing to purchase a product grown by Black farmers. So I had that experience. Also back then, we couldn't get a sheller to shell for us with us paying them. They wanted the market. They said, we'll buy your pecans and we'll shell them and sell to Ben & Jerry's, which was no different than what was happening. In the end, we managed to, Ben & Jerry's strong-armed their major supplier, and that's how we made it happen back then. But I made those contacts again. And we went from getting $1.35 to $2.35 per pound for pecans in shell to dealing with Equal Exchange and a couple of other markets to getting $6 per pound for pecan halves and then $5.50 per pound for pieces. So, you know, that's a great market. In fact, they've placed an order for more than we can produce ourselves this year. But we're working with other growers in the area to develop a pecan co-op. We have Satsuma oranges. The crop has already been bought, although it hadn't been fully matured and been picked yet. So these are things we want to introduce our farmers in the area to, these alternative crops. That's part of the goal of new communities. You know, you can't just be in this little bubble and do good for yourself. You got to look out for others in the area. We are also trying to develop a community hub. We've been given a nearly 47,000 square foot former Winn-Dixie store building, and we're trying to develop that into, we call it a community hub, not just a food hub, because we've partnered with the hospital in looking at how this building in one of the poorest areas of the city of Albany, and the area where most of the people, where the largest number of people, I should say, end up at the emergency room. So we're looking at trying to develop, look at food and health and merge all of this to train our people and so forth. I could go on and on about some of the various projects we have. You know, the last one I'll tell you about is bees. You know, I've always been afraid of bees, but we actually were able to get beehives out to train our farmers to take care of them and then get beehives out to them.
That's wonderful. Thank you. It's wonderful to hear, you know, how much it's not just you acquire this land, but it's that we always use this word stewardship. It's what you're able to do once you have it, and all of the ladders of opportunity that are built upon that. And I know you're able to bring in other people from outside of just South Georgia to train there and learn about agriculture, and you're talking about these markets as well. So there's just so much education that comes out of that. So it's just kind of this gift that keeps on giving. But important to start with was you all having control of that land.
And we
so
were
I want to shift now to, oh, sorry.
We were impacted by the pandemic. You know, we have cabins and we have space for meetings and so forth in that big antebellum house. We have not been able, we've lost all of that income because of the pandemic. So things are not so easy for us right now. Not that we were making such a great profit, but it took some of the income away. So it's pretty tough for us right now with cash flow. Mm-hmm. But the land is paid for, and we're trying to keep moving forward.
That's fantastic. So switching gears a little bit, just so we can talk about the film itself. Helen, I'm just curious about what drew you to make Arc of Justice in the first place. We saw that it came out in 2016. Last year was the 50th anniversary of New Communities, of the original land trust property there in Georgia. And so just wondering kind of what brought you to this project in the first place, and how have, in your work, have you seen the power of storytelling to be able to get stories like this out that really impact change in the world?
Great. Well, thank you for that question, and thank you to the Denver Foundation and the Urban Land Conservancy for pulling together such a wonderful event and group, and for the launch of this wonderful initiative. Making this film was an incredible honor, really. I had been working, prior to becoming a documentary producer, I had worked for many years on the ground doing community land trust development and providing technical assistance. And then largely because of the power of storytelling and having somewhat of a journalist background, I kind of segued into making films and making documentaries that would really promote the causes that I cared about, because I really do believe that storytelling and film in particular can move people to action and can convey the power of a model like community land trusts, or tell a really important piece of history. And in the late 90s or mid 90s, I guess, I made a film called Homes in Hands, which was the first short documentary about community land trusts that became like this treasured tool resource for organizing community land trusts around the country. It featured CLTs in Durham, North Carolina, in Burlington, Vermont, and the very, very beginning of the Sawmill Community Land Trust in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it was many years after that there was the precursor to Tony's organization, to the Grounded Solutions, was the National Community Land Trust Network, was working on organizing, trying to develop community land trusts in communities of color. And it turned out to be a harder sell, I think, than anybody anticipated. And there was a committee that was formed called the Heritage Lands Committee that was looking at ways of developing resources or thinking about what the issues were that communities of color and African-American communities in particular were confronting and thinking about developing land trusts. And John Davis, who's kind of the CLT sage, wise sage, and scholar and
I believe
activist.
he's attending today.
Well, shout out to John Davis, which I try to do at any given moment. You might have noticed his name in the credits. He was the co-producer of Arc of Justice with us. And John, who was really instrumental in creating this heritage lands idea, kept pushing the idea of telling the origin story of the community land trust movement, and kept talking about new communities and this place in Southwest Georgia. And I found it kind of shocking and embarrassing, frankly, that I knew nothing about new communities. I had been working in this field for many, many years, and didn't know anything about the fact that community land trusts came out of new communities and out of the civil rights movement, really. And so it was thanks to John that we made our way to new communities. It was right after Shirley and Charles and their colleagues were able to get the Cypress Pond land, the plantation that they're now on. And as soon as we connected with them and went down there, we were just blown away by the whole situation. And as you could see from the film, Shirley Sherrod is an extraordinary person and storyteller herself. And we just could feel, and we knew that the story needed to be told and that it would be a really powerful film. And I just want to also just say that we were also doing a series of short films about different community land trusts in communities of color. And one of those was in Atlanta. And that's when we met Tony Pickett, who was then the executive director of the burgeoning community land trust in Atlanta, with all of the different challenges that presented. And it was partly Tony's encouragement also about the importance, how important it would be for African-American communities that were considering developing land trusts to know the origin story, to be inspired by people like Shirley Sherrod and Charles Sherrod and the leaders that were so involved in the civil rights movement, who saw it as a priority to get hold of that much land and to begin this process of developing community land trust and a way of kind of putting a stake in the ground and around economic empowerment and everything. So, so when we developed, when we only filmed there for a couple of days, but we just developed this extraordinary amount of footage to make the film. And little did we know that, here we are distributing the film, and it is being used very definitely for its original purpose, which was to inspire particularly communities of color to think about the issues, to learn about the history of land trust, but to sort of demystify the notion of community land as opposed to individual ownership of land and home ownership that comes along with owning the land. That was kind of a stumbling block, I think, or a barrier that had to be considered, because sharecroppers in the case of Albany, Georgia, had been thrown off their land when they registered to vote, and the idea of not owning your land was really problematic. So I think that the film, by virtue of the fact of who's in it and how powerful each of the individuals are, but the whole collective was, it really makes a case for the importance of cooperative, as Charles Sherrod said, cooperative everything, cooperative, buying, cooperative selling, cooperative owning. And the other part that was the kind of surprise was just how much of a broader audience this film would be appealing to and powerful for showing. And I think particularly in this moment that we find ourselves in, where all of these issues around racial justice and voter suppression and economic equity issues, economic disenfranchisement, racism, et cetera, that it's really important to have these stories of resilience and how people have overcome and persevered. And I think Arc of Justice is an inspirational tool for fighting the good fight on many different levels, but in particular, affordable housing, permanently affordable housing and community land trusts. It really I think moves that agenda forward. So
Well, thank you, Helen, so much for those words and for your work and blessing us with this wonderful film. I think it is so powerful. And in general, you know, we're working up against a traditional capitalist system that would not necessarily support this idea of cooperative ownership and cooperative stewardship of land. But what I think but having that image of it makes it less scary, makes it feel like something that makes a lot of sense in the right situation, and also in ways, you know, gives us a tangible example of how things could have looked different in this country if we actually had our 40 acres and a mule to start with. You know, it's like, this is something where, look, if you have the land, look at all the things, all the positive things that can come from that. And we see a lot of negative hold in the system by having that land ownership. So with that, I'd like to shift to Tony Pickett and his work with Grounded Solutions. Just talking, again, we've talked about New Communities itself really being born out of the civil rights movement. You and I and Aaron Mearpaul and Mark Marshall from ULC and some of our partners from Elevation Community Land Trust and others from around the country had the honor of being able to go and physically visit New Communities last year to honor the 50th anniversary. And so that really helped us also get directly in touch with the outcome of the civil rights movement. And of course, the film opens with words from the Honorable John Lewis, whom we recently lost, but how wonderful to be able to hear his words in this film. And one thing that he stated, a quote of his in reflecting on the civil rights movement, was that there was this growing feeling on the part of individuals and leaders within the movement that if you had your own piece of land, you could do things and wouldn't be dependent on others. And so with that quote, I'm just thinking we're talking about how significant owning land is for creating equity, for building not just wealth, but I really focus on intergenerational wealth, right? Having something to pass on, having something that is going to provide value to Black families for generations to come. And so with that, just like to hear your thoughts about your work with Grounded Solutions, how you're seeing the CLT model hopefully proliferate across the country, but also kind of what are barriers that we're still seeing today to property ownership among communities of color.
Thanks, Aaron. And first, I just want to say I'm really excited to be joining all my friends in Denver. I got to visit with some of you before COVID fully took hold at the beginning of this year, and I had plans to come back several times this year, but I've had to change those. And I'm so glad that you mentioned our 50th anniversary celebration of the origin of the Community Land Trust model with Shirley and Charles and everyone in Albany last year. And I just want to say that originally, Grounded Solutions, who sponsored that event, we were supposed to have a conference in Minneapolis, of all places. And for whatever reason, when I knew that it was the 50th anniversary of the founding of New Communities last year, I just insisted that we be on the land with Shirley and Charles and everyone in Albany to celebrate that. And I had no idea what this year would bring. And people were pushing me to try to celebrate it this year. But I said, no, it has to be 2019. And so I'm just thankful that whatever impulse, whatever divine direction that I received to do that, we did it last year, and when we were all together to celebrate that milestone. You know, I think in answer to your question about barriers, first, I just want to start off by acknowledging that we are all living on land that was stolen from indigenous people. We have to start at that point to acknowledge that. Acknowledging the hurt, I think, is part of the process of healing that Shirley was talking about earlier. And we also need to fully acknowledge that we live in a nation built on free labor from the enslavement of Black people for generations. When we talk about building wealth, we start at a disadvantage because our labor was stolen from us for so long. And so it's time to start thinking about what is the mechanism, what is the system change, what is the mindset change that's needed to overcome those things. You mentioned it, Aaron, the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule for Black families after the Civil War. If we'd had that, things might look completely different for a majority of Black families in this nation today. But unfortunately, that happened, and even subsequent to that, there are additional barriers that were put in our path. Discrimination and racially restrictive deed covenants really enforced segregation and prevented land ownership for families of color for decades. Access to mortgage financing by people of color was limited by redlining, and that was intentionally created by federal policy. It didn't just happen because a few folks were not thinking in the right way. It was set in stone and enacted by federal policy with an intent to disadvantage families of color. And that wasn't just Black families, it was brown families and Asian families, anyone who was not white. And so what that has resulted in is a racial wealth gap today. And we know, based on the data, that white families on average have a net worth that's 10 times that of the average Black family. So how are you expected to gain access to land by purchasing it in the open market if your basis of wealth is so much lower than others around you? So expecting us to work harder or somehow create that wealth and make up the difference in one generation even is a near impossible task for most folks in this nation today. And it's not just an issue about barriers to land ownership. Even the current appraisal methods allow for devaluing of assets in Black and brown communities. The most recent data analysis shows that homes in majority Black neighborhoods are undervalued by about $48,000 per home. And when you do the math for the population in this country of Black people, that equates to about 156 billion in lost equity. So when you talk about creating wealth, that's money that we're owed, that should be due to us. And so I would just say, we at Grounded Solutions, in order to try to start to mitigate, to right the wrong, we've challenged our over 200 members across the country, including several organizations there in Denver, to really think about expanding access to permanently affordable housing and other forms of housing with lasting affordability, as we call it. Our goal is to create 1 million new homes with lasting affordability over the next decade. When we say we celebrated 50 years of community land trust activity, our estimates show that community land trusts and other programs that produce permanently affordable housing have created about 255,000 units in that 50-year span. We need it to be much larger in order to meet the demand. We knew even before COVID that 18 million families, 18 million households in the country were spending more than 50% of their annual income on housing. That's unaffordable. And so how do we make up for that? Again, we're whittling away at it, but we're not working alone, but our contribution would be 1 million new homes. And so when you start thinking about what's the impact of 1 million new homes, our estimates show that generates about $45 billion in annual economic activity and supports just over 600,000 new jobs. And so if you start to target that impact for communities of color, and we start to educate and cultivate leaders of color to do the work, to be trained in implementing these programs, just as Shirley and all the other civil rights leaders intended and are doing still at Resora. We could make a dent in the kind of change that's needed across this country. And so I just would say to folks, we are encouraging folks to join us in pushing for that change and organizing and advocating and pushing for policy changes. We need policy changes at the state, local, and federal level to make that million homes with lasting affordability goal happen. So it's not all just about, sometimes the conversation is around resources, money. I'm saying to folks, hey, you've heard it over and over again for the majority of this year. It's time to vote and vote for change. So, Shirley and all the other civil rights leaders really were looking at this as, again, a means of empowering people, giving them self-determination so that they could exercise their right to vote. And so that's really the most critical thing I think we can ask people to do right now. Again, I'm just trying to work with our team at Grounded Solutions to push this word out, to push the message out, and to engage all of our members and partners in this effort. And I'm really encouraged by what I'm seeing. I'm seeing our major banks and major foundations saying racial equity is a priority for them for the first time in my entire career. They've sort of hinted at it before, but now they're really pushing it front and center in their requests for proposals. They want to support organizations that are led by leaders of color because they feel that we, and it's appropriate, we know what our communities need and what are the best strategies to be implemented in those communities. So again, I think what the Denver Foundation is doing is on the cutting edge of where philanthropy should be right now. And I just want to be able to support and participate with all of you in making it happen.
Thank you so much, Tony. And we will, in these last few years that I've been involved in affordable housing, I think it's been really interesting for me to kind of come from outside and being newer to the space, but feeling that, this, for us to be able to really focus on permanence is so critically important for that idea that, affordable housing is affordable real estate of any kind is it's hard to deliver. It's expensive and it's difficult. And so, if we're going to put all of these investments in up front, making sure that we are going to have this long lasting impact is so important. And also, we are in this time now where I know a lot of us here didn't just have an awakening to systemic racism or structural barriers that have been, impediments to advancement by people of color in this country. But the fact that there is this broader reckoning by those in power in this country, that people are listening. And so it's so important that we are ready to have a lot to say and to push and to have a film like this and to have stories like all of you are telling about what we can do and saying, so it's not extreme to say, no, we're going to own this land and it's going to be a community benefit forever. and that's, that's what we need here. I think people are finally listening. And so I'm so glad to know that you all are here and there are so many others around the country who are really pushing for that. I'd like to end with, we'll start with LaDawn and then open things up for the overall panel to be able to speak to, we've talked about land particularly and property ownership. And what was also came out of the film was just the pride that people had in knowing that this was their, I think there's just something to physically owning a piece of this country that makes you feel really tied to what's happening here. And as we know, the country, as Tony noted, this was stolen land, but then the structure that was created on top of that was this property ownership system, and all of your true rights as a citizen flowed from you being a property owner, right? And so that is a core to what we need for building equity moving forward. But also from that comes all the things that Shirley talked about with, you know, how they're farming the land and selling what they're producing and using it for education and all these other things. And so I just wanted to bring LaDonna in to speak to just other mechanisms that you're working with in philanthropy, other ways to advance equity beyond just acquiring and owning land.
Thanks, Erin. And I want to thank everyone on the panel. And of course, I love the film. I've watched it several times. But just to your question, and maybe to engage us more deeply in conversation and thinking about equity and what we're doing at the foundation, and I would say, and more particularly with BRIC. So the Denver Foundation, over the last 20 plus years, has really been on this journey internally and externally to focus and, I would say, dismantle and reset ourselves to be inclusive and to move towards racially equitable practices. That includes creating intentional tables where there are people of color, people that represent the full arc of our community, making decisions about where grant dollars go, other resources that we have access to, how the foundation wields its influence, how it asserts its advocacy on behalf of low-income and communities of color. And I would say more so elevating what philanthropy looks like. A lot of people have in their head that it's an older white gentleman with millions of dollars, and that's not true. And it's something that we've really focused on as far as every communication, every social media, every way in which we are sharing the stories about how people are creating change in the community. We have a very inclusive mix of community members, community leaders. We all are philanthropists. So just to be clear, all 56 of us in this Zoom event, we are all philanthropists. We all invest our time, our talent, our treasure, our testimony, or our voice. And we also invest our social ties, the ways in which we collectively pull together to support community, to actually be the beloved community I think John Lewis spoke to at the very beginning of the video. This beloved community is something where it's a very eclectic mix, a very diverse mix of community members around a table equally and equitably connecting and working together in a way that benefits all. And so with the BRIC Fund, and more specifically, we really have, I think, kind of met an apex of our work when thinking about the three things that Ms. Shirley mentioned earlier: the training, the healing, and working together, by really creating intentional space for leaders of color to come together, to share and learn from one another, to build their capacity to be able to I would say move beyond surviving to thriving, where, you know, when you're surviving, you're in a headspace where you're just like, I hope we're going to make the doors stay open till tomorrow. When you get to move into the space, as this film has suggested, with the purchase of the land and being able to work the land and create a unified community, it's a very different mindset. You can look well beyond just tomorrow. You're looking at multiple generations in the future, and how what you are building and what you are doing is actually going to edify your community at the moment and in the future. And then I also want to speak to, as well, when we're talking about achieving equity, it also means really understanding and creating intentional access, and also recognizing and doing something about overdue reinvestment. So when you've mentioned the 40 acres and a mule and the other ways that communities of color have been standing at the starting line for over 400 years, while those with privilege and power have circled the block several times, you know, this is that moment to think about what is necessary and what is needed in order to right the inequities that have been put upon communities of color for generations. The last thing I would say too, and Tony did a great, Tony, you were so all in my remarks for this question. I just want you to know that. But just thinking about the laws and the policies, the things that have been set up literally to handcuff folks to not be able to progress. Those are things that are, I think, now in this double reckoning of COVID and racial unrest, certainly are being brought to life, and people cannot turn away from dismantling it to addressing it. I agree with you, Tony. I think that, yes, banks and institutions are looking at racial equity. They're saying the words, but I think the greater push forward is going to ensure that the people around the table making the decisions about how those institutions and organizations and companies invest look like the people on this call, that look like the people in this Zoom, and that we're really being intentional about not going backwards. This can't be the, what I would say back in the day, as my grandmother would say, kind of like the one-off, where we just give you enough to keep you quiet. Those days are over, and I think we're in a very unique space, again, to prepare people of color to step into the moment, and I would say beyond the moment, but fully into the movement, to address the trauma and pain that has been suffered for multiple generations, and then really to work together. And that goes beyond just people of color working together. That includes our allies, or I say those who really want to be active, our accomplices, in actually creating a racially equitable society.
I think that comment, LaDon, specifically about, people are saying the right things, and we're hearing more groups of people saying the right things, but it definitely is up to all of us, but not only all of us that have the darker skin tone here, but more importantly, the ones with the lighter skin tone that are already in those rooms, holding each other accountable to actually make these things happen. We can help point out the problems, but to the extent that we're not always in those rooms and we're not the ones making the decisions necessarily in great numbers yet, we need folks that are controlling those levers of power to be taking on this mantle. Are you, so just, Ms. Sherrod, also just wondering kind of you talked a little bit about COVID. Just what we saw in the film was, a very stark example of a barrier to, in terms of not being able to hold on to the original land and not having access to capital the same way that others, that non-Black people would. And so I want to note that it was just brought to my attention today, I didn't realize this, that your original land for folks here in Denver was actually larger than the Stapleton redevelopment area. What is now, the name has been changed recently to the Central Park neighborhood, but that is a large neighborhood here in Denver, and what you all owned was about 1,000 acres more, and yeah, so just for some perspective there. But I'm just curious about what was that experience like, and how are you, how do you see this CLT model being able to be used by others going forward, and how has it benefited, your community directly?
Yeah, I can tell you with 6,000 acres, that was, we are surrounded by plantations. For example, Woodruff, who was Coca-Cola, owned a 30,000 acre plantation. The Mellons are 25,000, all in the same county where I grew up. But for us to get our hands on 6,000 acres, I can tell you one of my uncles, who was a farmer, who would come up to assist us. He would, in my family, they call me Ann. He said, "You're Miss Ann now." I said, Uncle Walt, I don't own this myself. We all own it together. No, you Miss Ann. They understood what it meant to have that much land. And I can't begin to tell you how much it hurt to lose that much land. But when you go back to our history with land ownership, our people coming out of slavery knew there were a lot of important things, but two were very important. That was owning land and getting an education. And they knew that owning land could help move you toward getting that education as well and uplifting your family. So I grew up on a farm and, picking cotton and doing all that hard work. I didn't have the appreciation for it that I later had. And I didn't have the appreciation for what my family did. My great-grandparents, I don't know whether they were here during slavery or came to the area later on, but they sharecropped. And I lived in somewhat like a community land trust then, although they made sure each family member had their own plot. And it totaled about 4,000 acres, and it was called Hawkinstown because we were Hawkins. So to have Black people owning almost 15 million acres of land, or around 15 million acres around 1910, and then have us down to 2.5 million acres or less today, you look at the wealth that they stole from us, they took it from us. What it would have meant to pass that on, from one generation to the next. So I got into that so much that that's something I've worked on for 55 years now, after my father's death, when I got involved in working in the movement and in this area. I'm sorry, I got into my storytelling so much. You asked me about the pandemic and you're muted.
Just realized. No, I was just commenting on that was one of the issues that had come up, but no, you answered that beautifully. And I think we're all very grateful to hear those very personal stories. I think that is, that's the unique perspective that we love to hear from you. So thank you. I'm actually going to pivot now for our last just over 10 minutes to some of the questions that we've gotten from our audience. The first one I'm going to direct initially to you, Tony. Since we have national perspectives here, this person is curious as to kind of what promising practices we're seeing across the country, or that you're seeing, that integrate workforce development with affordable housing and community land trusts.
Yes, I would say one thing, it's hard to achieve something if you're not going to measure it, create a plan for it, all the things you would normally do when you're trying to get to an outcome. Equity is just as much of a process as it is the outcome. So I would say you have to create, first of all, a process that says you're going to incorporate workforce development as part of the equitable outcomes. One of the best examples of that, I can tell you, is a project called the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. It's a new outdoor park that's built on an abandoned freeway bridge segment that's been decommissioned. It's going to be repurposed into a brand new public park between the downtown district of Columbia and wards 7 and 8, the Anacostia neighborhood, probably the last predominantly African-American neighborhood in Washington, D.C. And early on, the creators of the Bridge Park created with the community, and it wasn't just leaders of nonprofit and government agencies getting in a room and creating the plan. They had a number of sessions, invested time and effort in cultivating and building a relationship with community leaders to co-create an equitable development plan. And one of the pillars of the plan is workforce development, both construction and post-construction. So being able to have a first source jobs arrangement so that folks who live in the neighborhood are trained and have the first opportunity for those jobs is one of the best ways that I've seen to get to some good outcomes. And again, being able to set some metrics, because it's going to be a multi-year process, the kind of size and magnitude of the project, to be able to mark your progress along the way and adjust if needed along the way. If something isn't working and you can't get to the goal, that gives you the sign that you may need to change, and you may need to go back to the community and revisit some of your original assumptions about how you get to the goal. So I can say our member, the Douglas Community Land Trust, named after Frederick Douglass, is part of that effort. It was another component of that equitable development plan to prevent displacement, so that folks would have an opportunity to stay in that community, to be trained for the jobs that would result from the development, so they would benefit from it in the long term. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge that we're seeing across the country when talking about new investments and the types of investments and what is the measure of success. It should be to have stability and a thriving community, but oftentimes it's simply boiled down to a monetary goal as opposed to all of those other social impact goals that should be part of any equitable development strategy.
Thank you for that. Our next question, I'm going to pose this for LaDawn. As people of color look at new and different models of business ownership, the cooperative ownership model, is the Denver Foundation considering educational and funding systems for cooperative businesses in addition to nonprofits?
Thanks, Erin. So we have actually supported exploration and some cooperatives in the last few years under our economic opportunity area. And also some of those have come through our grassroots program called Strengthening Neighborhoods, where folks are starting to come together and have ideas about how to build a cooperative. We've had one around childcare. We've had one around interpretation and translation in communities of color. And those have literally kind of come through getting a small grant to now being very lucrative cooperatives where they're hiring from the community, employing people from the community, and utilizing their lived experience and their, I would say, kind of like their indigenous languages and experiences for those businesses to thrive. So we're very excited by those, but we also know there's other opportunities and other thoughts about how those can come to be as well.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is for Ms. Sherrod. You mentioned in that wonderful story that you just shared that sharecropping was a bit like a land trust. Could you explain for those who don't really understand kind of how those are different exactly? Can you kind of explain a little more about that?
Yeah, what I said was my family, the fact that they worked together to buy land, somewhat like community land trust, because even though we didn't just all put it together, we had about 20 people, 20 families, where the family worked together to help each family buy their land. So sharecropping is quite different from the community land trust, because not only do you not own anything, you end the year owing money rather than making money. And that's why that system was so bad for our people, and a system we needed to get away from. And there were all kind of ways they would cheat you. And, you know, those stories have come through the years from our family about what to look out for, but everybody didn't do that.
So I think that's interesting that, you know, it's similar in that you're working the land and there are people working together, but there's a huge difference there is in that actual ownership and in the agency that you have, that, you know, you're doing this for yourselves and building your wealth for yourselves versus for someone else. So thank you for that. Tony, I'm also curious about just kind of with your work with Grounded Solutions, how do you see kind of how successful are land trusts around the country currently, and you know, this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing every day, and we're excited about it, but we know that not everyone kind of embraces it in the same way. And so just kind of how's the movement going in building capacity and building more land trust and that acceptance across the country?
I would say it's going well, and it is expanding. The conversation is all about strategies for expansion, and I think we all understand that this model, it varies a great deal depending upon what local community priorities and desires are. So, and that's one of the beauties of the model, is that it's flexible enough to allow people to make it their own and to use it in a way that is most impactful for them. I would say one of the things I can suggest is a new CLT publication by the Center for CLT Innovation has been released, called On Common Ground. I'm a contributor along with Urban Land Conservancy and many land trust organizations, not just here in the US, but across the world, all talking about sort of their experience. And one of the things I focused on in my chapter is the need to grow to greater scale in the future. And so I would say one of the promising examples of that is the work that we've been doing in Houston, Texas, where very different from other CLT organizations, the city of Houston and the mayor in particular has made it a high priority to use the community land trust to repair and bring back homeownership access for the African American population in Houston in response to the previous storm damage that Houston has suffered from the hurricanes. And so having that already in place and supported by the city, and also the Houston Land Bank, which is a whole separate entity, very different from a land trust, but all of those three entities partnering, the city and the land bank creating the real estate pipeline that the land trust needs in order to expand its portfolio, that has had tremendous success. Even throughout all of this chaos and traumatic experience of COVID-19, they've been building and selling houses to low and moderate income families the entire time. And so I think that's just a testament to the resilience of the model. So we talk about a climate change impacted place and layering on all the things that are happening now in addition to that, and still being able to weather all of that and successfully accomplish your mission. I would say that's a real testament to the flexibility and the tenacity of those folks who are involved in implementing the model there. But again, I can tell you all across the country, folks are all grappling with it and doing the same thing, figuring out how best to adapt it to meet the needs of folks in their communities with their experience. So I just am trying to focus, along with Grounded Solutions, on building capacity, understanding, and bringing more resources to the table so that it's not so difficult. As a practitioner, I know, and Helen mentioned it, I was dealing with a lot of challenges in introducing that model in Atlanta way back when. But now that's an up and running and successful organization, partnering again with the local land bank to create the kind of impact that is really going to benefit large numbers of families. I think that is the thing I've heard over and over again from activists and organizers, that they're frustrated that they can't do more for people because they don't have the resources, they don't have the capacity to do it. So I'm trying to figure out the means to solving some of that challenge for folks.
Thank you for that. So we're in our final minute. So just, I want to say thank you to everyone on our panel, first and foremost. Thank you for your thoughtfulness. Thank you for your passion and your commitment, and just your efforts to move us forward in this work. this critical work around cooperative and permanent land ownership and just broader issues of economic and racial justice in this country. I want to thank you, Helen, for producing this beautiful film and for allowing us to have this tool, as we said, this storytelling tool to explain what this is about. Because if we just kind of describe, okay, so people own this land communally and then they work it together and then somebody else owns the improvement, or that's just so dry. But to have real people speaking and seeing them on the land, it's just so powerful. And so I hope that events like this are what you had in mind when you put that forward.
Very much so.
And so we're very grateful to you and your artistry and your work in producing the film. To Tony for everything that you do, working across the country to advance this work as well. It's just, it's so important, and we're so grateful. To LaDawn and the Brick Fund, we're so proud to have this here launched in Denver, in Colorado, and all the work that the Denver Foundation is doing and your leadership there. Thank you. And finally, but not least, Ms. Sherrod, Mrs. Sherrod, thank you for joining us today and for your time and for your warmth in hosting us at your property and all the work that you've been doing for all these decades and all the people that you've touched. And we're just so grateful to have you as a role model and just wish you the greatest of successes at Resora in Albany, Georgia. So with that, thank you to our audience for taking the time to be with us today. If you shared a question that we were not able to get to, we will get our panelists to provide written answers. Some of the later questions that came in were more specifically around working with financial institutions and how do they really, maybe they're looking at these issues now, but do they really have the same sense of urgency that we'd like them to have, and how are they understanding the land trust model, things like that. So, and then also, so following this, all of you who have RSVP'd, you will be receiving an email from us that provides links to the recording. This was a recorded event, and so you'll be able to access that. The recording will not include the movie though, because that is licensed, but we will have the link to take you to the website to be able to access the film yourself. Let's see. And there will also be follow-up information on ULC's website, which is urbanlandc, the urbanland, the letter C.org. So with that, thank you again for your time.
And how people can access the film, right? Also, you'll provide a way for people to access the film themselves.
Yes,
individually or their organizations.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So all of that will be available both on ULC's website, urbanlandc.org, and in a follow-up email. And that will link to the various organizations represented here, Grounded Solutions and Brick, and to the film itself. So with that, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good to see
And
you.
vote.
That's right.
Vote.
Exactly.
I'm dropping off my ballot right now.
Bye.